On the screen, you see a picture of an excavation. That is the mound in Jericho. One of the most controversial and more important subjects that is going to determine a great deal of how we can date the events, not only the events that followed, but also the events that came before. Since Jericho signifies the beginning of the conquest of Eretz Israel, and consequently we can figure out when the Exodus was. We also can figure out what the time of the temple was, which according to the tradition was 480 years after they came into the land. So when we date this particular period, this particular amount, when did this event happen, the falling of the walls of Jericho, will become a very important issue. And we will actually discuss this a little bit later. But first, I want to give an introduction. Today, this week, it's going to be a general introduction both to Jewish history, what we intend to do, and what history generally is learned. How do we know what happened in the past? And then we will end with a question of dates, because scholars are going to be debating when did something happen, and it's not always so clear. How do we know that something happened that tells us when this actually happened? What we know is only the years of the kings, for example. And that's how we figure out one king came after another. We figure out how many years they follow until we find some event that we can approximately date, and then we go backward and we figure out when that king lived. But first, let me introduce why we're giving this course. The Torah says that Am Israel is a nation that dwells alone in solitude. Am levadat ishkon. It was connected to almost every nation and every empire that ever existed. And yet, we were not connected or in any way swallowed by any of the cultures. On the contrary, we outlived all the powerful nations, many of whom even tried to destroy us. Empires come and go. Egyptians disappear, Babylonians defeat the Assyrians, then they are overtaken by the Persians, where they are swallowed by the Roman Empire. And we see that throughout this period of time, the Jewish people are never absent. They don't disappear. They continue to be. It's like the world keeps changing, but the background, like a background of a picture that moves. But the main subject, the Jewish people, remains always in the forefront. The Jews' history is a history of perseverance. We outlived the Crusades, the Inquisition, the German crematoria, and the Jews watched world powers fade into oblivion. Many of these powers tried in vain to annihilate the Jewish people, torturing us with eternal hatred. And yet, we have endured. Jewish history, therefore, is a history that reminds us that we have a mission in the world. And that's what the Torah says, Zechor yemot olam, dinu shnot dor vador. The Torah says you have to study history to understand why Hashem chose us and that we have a mission in the world. So studying history is also a way of appreciating our own time. What should be our contribution? Since history is a chain, we are a link in that chain. What should be our function? History demonstrates that the Jewish people are the main characters. And that is what God's plan is for the world. In fact, the Jewish people created the concept of history. Until the Jewish people, monotheism, arose, pagans always thought of the world as being always cyclical, following the seasons. Even their gods were born in the winter, and they died in the spring, or they revived again in the spring. As you know, the history of Christianity is the history of life and of birth and death. But the problem is of paganism is that it always happens every time the same way. Every spring they're born, and every winter they die. So there is no linear progress. It's always repeat the same. The Jewish people, on the other hand, Torah told us, no, that we begin at a certain point, but we keep moving along a horizontal line that ends with the time of the Mashiach, the time of the Messiah. And we are the keepers of that history. We are, in fact, not only the players, but also the keepers. Now, I want to talk a little bit about how do we study history. And I want to take this time to speak a little bit about what is called historiography, or the way that we actually learn what happened in the past. And I want to give you a few important points that we're going to be using. First of all, contemporary accounts. Things that happen that tell us something about the events in that time by people who actually wrote about them. They didn't necessarily wrote a book of history, but they may have written something about the names of the kings, the dynasties, the number of years that they were. I want to give you a little bit, just generally, the Bible in the biblical period is perhaps the most important account. And many scholars, as we will see, actually do not like to use the Bible as history. In fact, they want to accuse the Bible of being a book of fiction. And some of them, as we will see in a moment, use archaeology or archaeological data to actually debunk the Bible itself. But the Bible is an important element, and we will continue to discuss this. There are also papyri. Papyri are, similar to paper. The way that they used to write in ancient times for 2,000 years. It was invented in Egypt, and it became a very important form of maintaining records. Fortunately, some of these records we have, and we have been able to preserve them. I want to talk to you briefly about some of the, what is a papyri? So if you take a look, for example, here, this is called the Royal Tablet, the Royal Papyrus of Turin, the Royal Canon of Turin. This it is a papyrus, and it contains the names of kings and the years they reigned. So we can figure out at least the names of the kings, of the pharaohs, when they reigned, at least in relationship to each other. So if we find any point in any of them that we know about, then we can figure out the ones that were before and the ones that were after. Sorry, that I think that you are not seeing this. Here you see this, the papyrus. This is in a list of pharaohs. It's called the Royal Canon of Turin because it is in the Egyptological Museum of Turin. So here you have a form in which we actually learn something about how we know what is in history. I want to point out something else that we do. We also use stela. Stelas are essentially stone in which something is written. Usually is a monument that celebrates usually a victory by a king. This is a very important document. It is called the Merneptah Stele, and that records the victory of Ramses over several nations. One of them happens to say it's Israel. And the date of this stela It's going to be very important in telling us when actually he's talking about. Is he talking about the Exodus and he's trying to lie that he defeated the people of Israel? That is the question we will discuss. And that is another way that we know a little bit about history of documents that, like a stela. There are also other forms, and that is tablets, usually clay, and I'm going to give you one here. This is a clay tablet found on a place called Amarna. And it's interesting, you will discover that it is a letter written by a certain king called Labaya, written to the pharaoh, Akhenaten. This clay tablet is a letter found in the British Museum now. Now, who is Labaya appears from the time it is written and from the things that he is writing about, that it is none other than Shaul HaMelech Saul, an amazing discovery. We will discuss a little more about the archaeological discoveries of. So we have papyri, tablets, monuments, like the Merneptah stela. We also are able to date something by an amazing method called astronomical calculations. What does that mean? We know that the Babylonians, for example, the astronomer, priests of Babylonia, were famous for observing the night sky and recording important celestial events. These observations were gathered together in tablets, partly to guide, since whatever, if it was an eclipse and there was a catastrophe, they were able to say the next time you have an eclipse, be careful because something could occur. So they wrote this, and the way they wrote it, in incredible way, it's all collected in tablets called Enuma, Anu, and Lil, from the time of the gods Anu and Enlil, and it is of great significance for us to know the dates. Why? How does this help? In the year 2001, a great historian, the University of Glasgow, made a computer calculation using astronomical tables of when eclipses occurred. And he went back, figuring out from what these observations were, where the moon was at a certain position and so on, as he was able to determine certain dates. In fact, we're going to discuss later the exact date in which probably the eclipse that Joshua talks about in the book actually occurred. Day, month, and year. All of this from astronomical recalculations. Secondly, or finally, another thing which is used is also art. So, just for a moment, I want to give you there. For example, you have a piece of art, and that piece of art has a style. We know that we found this art of this kind somewhere else. So we can figure out when something something occurs from the fact that we see this particular art in a certain archaeological place. Let's say, for example, you know that a certain vase was made in Greece in the 10th century. And when you go to a place, an archaeological place, and you find this actual place, this actual vase, you now know that that event must have happened not later than the 10th century. So you see here the vases and some sort of artifacts. So this is the way that we actually can study history. So an archaeologist enters a certain spot and begins to dig, and then begins to find objects at a certain layer. So he knows, as you know, that usually in antiquity, people, after the city became old, was destroyed, it was covered with dirt, and then the next generation, 100 years later, will come and build the city usually on top of that. So what archaeologists go is they go layer by layer. So they may begin on the 20th century, and then they dig, and then they discover something from the 15th century. And then they will go down, and they'll see something from the year 1000, and then even further. And this is the way we come to archaeological digs. So how to read them. Okay, so this as far as what are the elements of history. How do we know history? Contemporary events, contemporary accounts, art, monuments, and documents. Now, I'm going to point out something very important to us as Jews, especially. Scholars, archaeological scholars in the past had the habit, partly based on atheism, partly based on trying to consider nothing about the nothing Jewish to be valid, and they tried to discount the Bible. In fact, they said that the Bible is a fiction. The reason for that is that they saw, for example, that, and I will discuss in a moment, the story of the conquest of Jericho, as we discussed before. They say that if the Exodus occurred, as apparently they thought it occurred, about the year 1200, when the Jews came to Israel in the year 1200, there was no Jericho. According to the archaeologists, Dame, a famous woman, Kathleen Kenyon, in the 50s, discovered that by the year 1200, Jericho had already been destroyed. The walls came down, and probably an earthquake, and the whole story of Joshua with the walls coming down and so on could not have happened, because by the time they came, Jericho was no longer there. Already had been destroyed. So therefore, the Bible is lying. Unfortunately, this story, if the Jews came to Jericho in the year 1200, the whole story of Jericho being conquered and the walls falling down is an act of fiction. And if that is an act of fiction, the fact that we were in Egypt and came to Israel is also an act of fiction. This is amazing. Now you say, is this ridiculous? Who believes in this? A lot of people. A lot of Israeli academics, Israeli archaeologists, of course others, even rabbis. You may know the famous conservative Rabbi David Wolpe gave a famous sermon saying that he doesn't believe the Exodus is a real story. However, a new breed of young scholars have come up together today with a revised chronology based on newly discovered Egyptian documents and astronomical calculations to show that the time of the Exodus was not in the year 1200, but the year 1400. And in that case, the time for the destruction of Jericho fits perfectly. The Bible is right on time. Previous generations have gotten their dating wrong. The archaeological evidence shows now that a large Semitic community lived in Egypt as foreigners, which then appeared. By the way, I want to show you this painting, if you look at this, I want to show you this painting now. It's an interesting painting that shows a group of Semitic-looking people. This picture here, from the way they are, the faces, the beards, and the garment show that these are Semitic people. So what are Semitic people doing in Egypt? That is exactly the issue that the new archaeologists discovered. And they also discover that apparently a whole group of these Semites live en masse. So not long after this period of time that we now date the Exodus, at Jericho come down the walls, as the Bible tells us. And we also begin to see an evidence of destruction of 45 cities in the Promised Land, all to match Joshua's conquest. So, as one of the newspapers said, understanding now the new scholarship, he says, it seems that the Bible is back in business. It is important for us to appreciate the importance of this discovery, because in fact, it goes to the heart of our belief in the Torah itself as an important historical document. When rabbis and academicians, and actually one rabbi was asked, do you keep Passover? He says, yes, I keep Passover. What do you keep Passover for? It's not, if you don't believe that the story actually occurred, why are you keeping it? So he said, well, I like the message. I'd like to suggest that this is a foolish answer, because would you base your faith and moral code on a book that is a fantasy? What is the message? And also, why would any people invent that they become from a group of slaves? In fact, we wouldn't want to think that we are slaves. Who would invent such a story if it were not true? So today, as we said, the pendulum is swinging. Scholars are revising the data, and now biblical stories are placed in the correct time and used as historical sources. I want to take this moment to analyze one important discovery, and this discovery matches exactly the story of the Bible. So let's take a look a little bit at the Bible. The first, in the book of Joshua, when they come after the death of Moshe Rabbeinu, Joshua takes over, and he sends 2 spies to the city of Jericho. It's in Joshua chapter 2. And they enter the house of a woman. In Hebrew, it's called Isha Zonah. A woman, if you can be translated, zon has 2 meanings. One is the woman is a prostitute. The other one is a zon, like mazon means giving him food, an innkeeper, had a hotel. It may be that the hotel with other services was not uncommon. In any case, her name was Rachab. So they went and they slept there, the spies. So the king of Jericho heard from the spies, from other people, that somebody are sending spies to spy out the land. So they sent a message to this woman Rachab and said, bring out the men who have come to you. They probably are spies. They realized that somebody had come. So the woman took the 2 men and hid them. And she said, it's true, the men did come to me, but I don't know who they are. So when the city was about close to dark, the men went out. I do not know where they went. Go quickly You can overtake them. And she sent them away, the police away. Then she took the spies, brought them to the roof, hid them in the stalks of flax. And the enemy, the people of Jericho, went away. Now, she goes to these spies and she says, and this is very important, I know that Hashem has given you the land, and that the fear of you has fallen upon us, and all the inhabitants of the land have dissolved because of you. For we have heard how Hashem dried up the waters of the sea for you, and what you did to the kings of the Amorites, whom you utterly destroyed. We heard and our hearts melted. Incredible. For Hashem is the God of the heavens above and the earth below. So she believes in Hashem. So now she says, swear to me by Hashem, because I did this kindness to you, that you will do kindness with me too, my father's household. You will keep, when you come to conquer the city, you will keep alive my father, my mother, my brothers, and my sisters, and all that is theirs, and that you will save our souls from death. So the men promised and says, yes, we will do that. So she said to them, go to the mountain, let the pursuers encounter you. And she sends them away. And the men say to her, take this cord of scarlet thread in the window through which you lowered us, and so that we will know that it's your house and nobody will touch you. And so she said, as it is, and she sent them forth. That's the story. In fact, when they went to Joshua, the two men were able to escape. Well, they said to Joshua, Hashem has given the land into our hands, and all the inhabitants of the land have melted because of us. Now, my dear friends, I want to show you how archaeology can actually be so helpful. I want you to take a look at the picture that I showed you at the very beginning of this class. And this, please pay attention, is the most amazing thing that I have seen in the whole story that I have learned. This is a picture taken by some German photographers of the excavations of Jericho. And you'll notice some very interesting facts. Number one, the houses, these houses that we see here, see I'm marking them, are on the wall, exactly as the Bible says, that the house of Rahab was on the wall. These houses were constructed between the citadel and the lower wall. These were not the dwellings of the wealthy, but rather the houses of the poor, because it was near where the stalks of the grain was there. And that also corresponds to Rahab being an innkeeper. An innkeeper needs food. So she was in the area where food was produced. These houses lower come directly onto the mountains, exactly, affording easy escape from the city, as the Bible says. So one more amazing thing, and this, please pay attention to this. Jericho was totally destroyed. The walls came tumbling down. But these houses that are the houses where probably Rahab lived remain intact and were not destroyed. This is one of the amazing things, that God destroyed the city of Jericho, but the house of Rahab and the area was not destroyed, as the promise was to keep them alive. We also learn that this was not only in a regular earthquake, there is no fire. Here, the Bible says that Joshua ordered the city to be, not only to be, it was destroyed by Hashem, the walls collapsed. May have been an earthquake, perhaps, that Hashem arranged for that particular moment. But in addition to this, he ordered the houses to be burned. And we found in all of these remnants, the signs of char and smoke, exactly as the Torah, as the Bible had actually written. And not only that, which is even more amazing, is that the city, after it is destroyed, Joshua makes a curse that nobody should ever build the city again. Archaeologists agree that this city was not built for hundreds of years. No, in a city that commands such an incredible position, that nobody ever built a city there for hundreds of years, is another corroboration that something supernatural has taken effect in this place. And so, if you look at this evidence, in this archaeological dig, that became really the source of a lot of doubt about the Bible itself. So great that even rabbis and academicians suggested that the whole story of the Exodus was wrong because this Jericho could not have been destroyed at the time the Jews had come because the city was already destroyed. Once we adjust the date and we realize that the Exodus took place earlier, then the destruction of Jericho corresponds exactly to the date of the Exodus. And we can, number one, date the Exodus, number one, let's say not right now, but the year 1300. And in addition to this, we can begin to date the destruction of Jericho for the right time. In addition to this, we also see a lot of the evidence of the destroyed fortified cities of Canaan that also took place at that time. So the archaeological evidence shows that exactly the time that Jericho was destroyed, other cities were destroyed in a very violent way, and all at the same time. That could only be the effect, the result of an invasion by the Jewish people that actually came in and conquered the land. And this, I want to just quickly talk about this. Joshua was an incredible general, and I'm going to just quickly tell the story of the conquest of Jericho, which I want to read to you. A frontal assault on Jericho was impossible because they did not have, they did not have battering rams, ladders. How were they going to go there? And while they were attacking, the slingstones, fire, and arrows, and any assailing attempt to scale the slippery slope would have been ending in disaster. So Jericho was confident that the Israelites were never going to get the better of the city in a frontal attack. So all of this was reported back to Yeshua by the two spies. And so the tribes assembled on the eastern back of the Jordan, ready to cross. And they crossed the Jordan, and they erected 12 standing stones to demonstrate that they came to this land of Israel, the promised land. They entered the promised land on the 10th day of the month of Nisan to celebrate Pesach. And then they came to Jericho. For 6 days, the warriors marched in silence. They trumpets once every day. The people of the city stared out with fear gripping their hearts as they saw the Jews marching with the Aron HaKodesh, the golden ark of Hashem, leading the huge silent army. On the 7th day, they went 7 times. And at that time, the earth shuddered, the ground convulsed and roared, and the mighty walls of Jericho cracked and crumbled, tumbling down. And a choking dust of cloud enveloped the plain, blotting out the sun. So eventually, with a deafening war cry, 8,000 warriors rushed up the slope of fallen bricks into the city, and They killed everyone there. And they were told not to touch anything that belonged to the Jericho people. They were not to take any booty, to burn everything. And this Rachav, the prostitute and her family, were safely escorted from the destruction to join the conquerors. In fact, according to some, she married Joshua himself. Jericho was left a smoldering ruin, cursed and abandoned for many, many years. And Joshua made a curse. It said, a curse before Hashem be any man who rises up to rebuild this city. So, in fact, this curse was fulfilled, and the destruction of the city and the burning of the city took place as well. Joshua was a brilliant general. He conquered many cities by avoiding frontal battles, relied on deception, military cunning. It's interesting that if you go to some military schools, among the great generals, one of them, of course, is Joshua. One of his great techniques was to come towards a city, as he did in the city of Chatzor and Ai, other cities that he conquered. The Bible records that he approached the city, and when the enemy saw them approaching, at one point they started to retreat. As they retreat, they drew the people out of the city in pursuit, thinking that they were being defeated. And at that time, another band of people waiting in ambush was ready to enter the city through the gates. But they did it in several places. He had excellent planning and execution, and the element of surprise. Many of the attacks of Joshua were at night, when people did not expect it. We also see that the famous battle that took over the place of Ayalon, which some say it was an eclipse that occurred. In the battle, he says, Shemesh v'givon dom v'yareach be'emek Ayalon. He said, he needs to finish the day. Let the sun stop in Ayalon. And says, you can see the scene, the setting in the west over the valley of Ayalon, while the sun rises in the east over Givon. According to the interpretation, he actually did this battle in the middle of the night, totally surprising the enemy. And the Canaanites were unable or understanding what he would do. The Israelites exploited every topographical and climate factors in order to disable the Canaanite chariotry. They had chariots. They usually chose the rainy season. We will see later in the story of Dvorah. So Joshua goes from city to city over the period of about 14 years, destroying most of the 45 cities of Canaan. And then once they get a foothold in the land, they divide the land among all the tribes, the 12 tribes. And we will discuss this. I want to point out quickly the map.
I have a question, Rabbi.
Yeah, one second. I just want to show you the map of yeah.
Can I ask you a question, or?
Yes. I just want to see if I can find the.
I'll ask you the question when you're looking for the map. There's a popular conception that when Joshua went, that they marched around the walls of Jericho, and that the soldiers of Jericho were watching from above. And the question is, why didn't they?
I want to just review this class. We discussed in this class essentially how to study history, a very important document to demonstrate that the Bible is and can fit with the archaeological evidence, contrary to what other scholars, atheistic scholars, anti-biblical scholars, and even rabbis try to do. We demonstrated that the archaeological evidence can very well fit with the story of the Bible. So we can actually see the Bible in a proper context. As the newspaper said, the Bible seems is back in business. We have archaeological evidence of how Jericho was destroyed, how the cities of Canaan were destroyed, and to demonstrate the validity of the Torah, of the Bible itself. And finally, I just wanted to point out that the story that we learned at the end of Rahab and the archaeological evidence of those houses built exactly how the book of Joshua describes. On the wall, nobody wouldn't have known that. And they couldn't have invented that story if the city had already been destroyed. How would they know how the houses were actually built in the wall? So that they were actually there. They knew already how they were there. So if there's no better helper to understand the veracity, the historicity of the Torah than to looking at the archaeological work of today. And we will discuss, God willing, in the next session, it will be next Wednesday. We will start talking a little bit about the period of the Judges up to Shaul. Today, I did essentially an introduction to our course.
Rabbi, may I